The lights in the Coalition Emergency Center flashed red. Alarms blared through the massive space station that served as the headquarters for the Galactic Coalition. Head Administrator Dae-ho Kim's hands shook as he read the report on his screen. 3 colony worlds had gone dark in the last hour. No signals, no communications, nothing. "Sir," a young officer called out from her station, "we're getting strange readings from the outer sectors. Something is moving toward Coalition space. Something big." Dae-ho closed his eyes. In the 300 years since the Coalition had formed, they had never faced a real war. Sure, there had been small fights and disagreements between member species, but nothing like this. Nothing that made entire worlds go silent. He knew what he had to do, even though the very thought made his stomach turn. The Coalition kept their greatest weapon frozen in time, waiting for this exact moment. A weapon from Earth, from the species that had mastered the art of war like no other. "Officer Sujai Park," he called out. The young officer stood straight, her uniform crisp and perfect. "Come with me. We're implementing the Awakening Protocol." Suji's eyes widened. Everyone knew about the protocol, but no one actually believed they would use it. "Sir, are you sure?" "The Council. The Council will have to accept it." Dae-ho cut her off. "We're at war." They took the elevator down, deep below the station's main levels. The temperature dropped as they descended. Level after level passed until they reached the bottom. The cryo chamber. The chamber was huge, filled with rows of cryopods. Most were empty now. Earth had fallen centuries ago, its people scattered across the stars. But the Coalition had kept some of humanity's best military minds preserved, frozen in time, waiting for the day they would be needed. They walked to Pod 47. Frost covered the glass, hiding the person inside. Dae-ho wiped it away, revealing the face of a man who had lived and died before the Coalition even existed. "General Han Bin Lee," Dae-ho said softly, "Earth's finest strategic mind during the resource wars. He saved his people from extinction 3 times before Earth became uninhabitable." Sujai stepped closer, studying the frozen face. He looked so normal. "That's what makes humans so interesting," Dae-ho said. "They look harmless, but they survived thousands of years of constant warfare. They developed military strategies that other species can barely understand." He pressed his hand against the pod scanner. Red lights turned green. The pod hummed to life, beginning the warming sequence. "Sir," Suji said, "the records say the last time we woke a human general, he was difficult to control." Dae-ho nodded. "That's why you're here, Officer Park. You'll be his guide to our time. Help him understand how things work now. Make him see that we're not his enemies." The pod systems beeped. Ice melted away from the glass. Inside, color returned to the general's face. His chest began to move. "What if he doesn't want to help us?" Suji asked. "He will," Dae-ho said firmly. "Humans have one trait that makes them perfect for this. They hate watching innocent people die. And right now, innocent people are dying by the millions." The pod opened with a hiss of warm air. General Lee's eyes fluttered. His fingers twitched. 300 years of sleep began to fade away. "Remember," Dae-ho told Suji, "he's going to be confused. The last thing he remembers is Earth dying. Be gentle, but be honest. We need him ready to fight as soon as possible." General Lee's eyes opened fully. They were sharp and alert, showing none of the confusion Dae-ho had expected. The general sat up slowly, his movements careful but precise. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough from centuries of silence. 312 years, sir," Suji answered. The general nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected. "And you're waking me up because—" "We're at war, General Lee," Dae-ho said. "A war we don't know how to fight." A small smile appeared on the general's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had expected this moment, who had known that sooner or later the galaxy would need what humanity had learned through countless wars. "Then let's get started." General Lee said, swinging his legs over the side of the pod. Tell me about our enemy. General Lee stood at the window of the observation deck, staring at the massive space station stretching out before him. Ships of different shapes and sizes moved between the station's arms. Most of them weren't human designs. 300 years had changed everything. How many humans are left? He asked Suji, who stood quietly behind him. Less than 1% of the coalition's population, she answered. After Earth became uninhabitable, most humans spread out among the stars. We mixed with other species, adapted to new worlds. Lee touched the cool glass. And Earth, what happened after I went into cryosleep? Suji took a deep breath. This was the hard part. The pollution got worse. The oceans died completely. By the time the coalition formed, Earth was empty. We maintain a memorial station in orbit, but the surface is still toxic. Lee nodded slowly. He had known this was coming. He had watched the beginning of the end before they put him to sleep. Still, hearing it hurt more than he expected. Show me the current military situation, he said, turning away from the window. Sujai led him to a large room filled with holographic displays. Maps of coalition space floated in the air, showing the movement of ships and troops. Red markers showed where the enemy had attacked. We've never fought a real war, Sujai explained. The coalition solved problems through talking, through trade deals. Our ships are mostly for show. Lee walked through the holograms, studying each detail. Your weapons, mostly energy-based. Laser cannons, plasma torpedoes. Some ships have rail guns, but we rarely use them. They're too destructive. Lee laughed, but there was no joy in it. War is destruction. Officer Park, you can't fight it halfway. He pointed to the red markers. These attacks, they're not random. There's a pattern here. Daeho entered the room, carrying new reports. What do you see, General? They're testing your defenses, Lee said, pushing different points, watching how you react. It's what I would do if I was planning a major invasion. He turned to face them. Tell me about the enemy. What are they? Suji activated another hologram. It showed strange, insect-like ships moving in perfect formation. We call them the Swarm. They appeared 6 months ago at the edge of known space. At first, they ignored our attempts to communicate. Then they started attacking. Biological or mechanical? Lee asked, studying the images. Both, Daeho answered. They seem to be some kind of hybrid. Their ships are grown, not built. They can repair themselves during battle. Lee's eyes narrowed, like an immune system fighting an infection. And you've never dealt with anything like this before. Suji shook her head. The coalition was founded on peace. Most of our member species gave up warfare thousands of years ago. We thought we were past this. Nobody gets past war, Lee said quietly. You just forget how to fight it. He turned to Daeho. I need to see your combat troops. Your best warriors, whatever you have. Daeho looked uncomfortable. We don't exactly have warriors. We have security forces, peacekeepers. Lee closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was a hardness there that made both Suji and Daeho step back. Then we'll make warriors, he said. Show me your young officers. The ones who haven't been taught that fighting is wrong. The ones who still understand that sometimes you have to stand and fight. The council won't like this, Daeho warned. The council won't exist if we don't stop the swarm, Lee replied. You woke me up because you needed a warrior. Now you have to let me work. Suji watched the general studying the battle maps. She saw something in him that scared her, not because it was alien, but because it felt familiar. Some part of her, some old human instinct, recognized what he was. A warrior, a killer, a survivor. I'll help you find your troops, she said. Lee looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. You understand, don't you? What's coming? Suji nodded. We're going to have to become something the coalition hasn't been for a very long time. Yes, Lee said. We're going to have to become dangerous. He turned back to the holograms, to the red markers showing worlds that had already fallen. Let's begin. The emergency alarms woke everyone on the station. Sujai ran to the command center, her heart pounding. She found General Lee already there, standing calmly in front of the main display screen. 3 more worlds under attack, Daho reported, his voice shaking. The swarm came out of nowhere. Our defense ships, they're being torn apart. Lee watched the battle footage with narrow eyes. The swarm ships moved like a single organism, flowing around coalition defenses like water around rocks. Their attacks were precise, efficient, and deadly. Look at their movement pattern, Lee said, pointing to the screen. See how they protect their larger ships, just like bees protecting their queen. He turned to Sujay. Get me everything you have on Earth's social insects. Bees, ants, termites, everything. Sujay quickly pulled up the files from the station's archives. Lee studied them, moving between the ancient Earth data and the current battle footage. They're not just similar to insects, he said after a few minutes. They're copying them. Their entire battle strategy is based on Earth's most successful survivors. A small smile appeared on his face, which means they can be beaten. How? Daho asked. We've lost 5 ships for every one of theirs we've destroyed. Because you're fighting them like they're ships, Lee said. You're not fighting them like they're a colony. He turned to Sujay. Get me a direct link to all surviving coalition ships in the battle zone. Sujay set up the communication link. Lee stepped forward, his voice clear and commanding. This is General Lee to all coalition forces. Listen carefully. Stop trying to destroy their big ships. Focus all your fire on the small ones on the outer edges of their formation. Don't shoot the ones that come to replace them. Wait for the next wave of replacements, then hit those. The coalition ship commanders hesitated, but they followed his orders. On the screen, they watched as the swarm's perfect formation began to break down. When ships on the edge were destroyed, others moved to take their place, leaving gaps in their defense. Just like insects, Lee said, satisfaction in his voice. They can't help themselves. It's programmed into them. When the barrier is broken, they have to fix it. They'll keep sending ships to plug the gaps until they've weakened themselves too much. Sujay watched in amazement as the swarm's attack faltered. Their unstoppable advance turned into confusion as their own instincts worked against them. Now Lee commanded. All ships, full attack on their center mass. Hit them while their defense pattern is disrupted. The coalition ships struck hard. Without their perfect formation, the swarm couldn't coordinate their defense. For the first time since the war began, coalition forces were winning. But victory came with a price. The command center screens showed the wreckage of dozens of coalition ships floating in space. Thousands of crew members had died following Lee's strategy. This is barbaric, one of the council members said, entering the command center. We don't sacrifice our people like this. Would you prefer to sacrifice entire worlds? Lee asked calmly. Because that's your other choice. The swarm doesn't take prisoners. They don't make peace. They consume everything in their path. There must be another way, the council member insisted, a way that doesn't involve so much death. There isn't, Lee said. This is war, real war, and it's only the beginning. He turned to Sujay. We need to prepare more ships, and we need to train their crews to fight the way humans fought. Not just with weapons, but with the understanding that survival sometimes requires sacrifice. Sujai looked at the battlefield display. They had won their first victory, but she could see in Lee's eyes that he was right. This was just the beginning. The swarm would learn from this defeat. They would adapt. And the coalition would have to become something new, something more like the humans they had once feared, if they wanted to survive. I'll start the training programs, she said. And General, thank you for saving those worlds. Lee shook his head. Don't thank me yet, Officer Park. The real fight hasn't even started, but at least now we know they can bleed, hit and run. General Lee's voice boomed through the training room. Don't stay in one place. Move, strike, disappear. The swarm expects direct attacks. They don't understand deception. Suji watched from the observation deck as Lee trained the Coalition's first real combat unit. The soldiers below were a mix of species, all volunteers who had joined after seeing the destruction the swarm had caused. Your ships are faster than theirs, Lee continued. Use that advantage. Don't fight fair. Fair fights are for fools and the dead. Daeho stood next to Suji, frowning. The council is worried. They say he's teaching them to be too aggressive, too human. The council isn't the one fighting the swarm, Suji replied. She pointed to the latest battle reports. 3 more swarm attacks had been stopped using Lee's tactics. His methods work. Below, Lee divided the soldiers into teams. Each team had a fast ship and a mission. Find swarm scout ships, attack them, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. It wasn't the Coalition's usual way of fighting. It wasn't honorable or direct, but it was working. Look at how they move now, Suji said. The soldiers had learned quickly. Their ships darted in and out of asteroid fields, using natural cover to hide their approaches. They're becoming hunters. That's what worries the council, Daeho said. We're not supposed to be hunters. We're supposed to be peacekeepers. The room's screens lit up with a new alert. A swarm fleet had been spotted near a mining colony. Lee's training session stopped immediately. Real target, he announced. Time to show me what you've learned. Teams 1 and 2, you're up. The soldiers rushed to their ships. There was no fear in their movements now, only purpose. Lee had changed them in just 2 weeks. Permission to join the mission, Suji said, stepping forward. Lee studied her for a moment, then nodded. You've been watching the training. Let's see if you learned anything. You're with Team 1. The ships launched quickly, using the new tactics Lee had taught them. They didn't fly in formation. Each ship took a different path, making it harder for the swarm to track them. Remember, Lee's voice came through their communicators. The swarm thinks like insects. They expect attacks from the front. Hit them from behind, from the sides. Make them chase you, then lead them into your partner's firing range. Suji's hands were steady on her ship's controls as they approached the mining colony. The swarm ships were there, moving in their usual perfect pattern. Team 2, make some noise, Lee ordered. Team 1, wait for your shot. Team 2's ships appeared suddenly, firing at the swarm's outer ships. Just as before, the swarm broke formation to chase them. But this time, they were ready for Lee's tactics. They split into smaller groups, trying to surround Team 2. They're learning, Suji reported. Good, Lee said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. That means they can be taught to fear us. Team 1, show them why. Suji's team struck from above, their ships diving through gaps in the swarm's defense. Their weapons targeted the command ships, which were now exposed. The swarm tried to reform their protective barrier, but they were too slow. Keep moving, Lee commanded. Don't let them predict your next position. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the swarm fleet was in ruins, and the mining colony was safe. The coalition ships had suffered no losses. Back at the station, Lee gathered the soldiers for a review. You did well, he said, but the swarm will adapt again. They'll find new ways to fight us, and we'll need to stay one step ahead. Suji saw the change in the soldiers' faces. They were proud, confident. They had fought like humans, and they had won. The council won't like the reports, Daeho said quietly. The council doesn't have to like it, Lee replied. They just have to understand it. This is how humans survived for thousands of years, not by being the strongest, but by being the most adaptable, by learning from every fight, every defeat, every victory. He looked at the soldiers, his new warriors. The swarm thinks they're the perfect hunters. We're going to teach them that humans wrote the book on hunting. And now we're teaching others to read it. General Lee stood alone in his quarters, staring at the holographic display of their latest battle. The coalition had won again, pushing the swarm back from 3 star systems. But the cost had been high, very high. Suju found him there, still watching the replay of the battle hours after it had ended. She noticed how his hands clenched every time a coalition ship exploded. "Sir," she said softly, "the casualty reports are ready." "How many?" he asked, not turning around. 843 dead. 3 ships lost completely. But we saved millions on those planets. Lee nodded slowly. 843 letters to write. He finally turned to face her. In the old days on Earth, commanders had to write to the families of fallen soldiers. Personal letters, not just official notices. Sujai looked down at her datapad. "The council says that's not necessary. They have standard messages for." "No," Lee cut her off. "Get me the names. All of them. And their families' contact information. They deserve better than a standard message." As Lee sat down to write, Suji noticed something on his personal terminal. It was open to his private logs. She caught a glimpse of words before he closed it. "The weight gets heavier with each victory, just like before, just like Earth." "Sir," she said carefully, "the council is meeting tomorrow. They want to discuss your latest strategy." Lee laughed bitterly. "They want to complain about it, you mean? Too aggressive. Too many casualties. Too human." He looked at the list of names on his screen. "They still don't understand what we're fighting." A new alert flashed across their screens. The swarm had changed their attack pattern again. They were now using the very tactics Lee had taught the coalition forces, but with a brutal efficiency that made them even more deadly. "They're learning," Suji said, watching the new battle data. "Just like you said they would." "Yes," Lee replied. "And now we have to learn faster." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "Tell me, Officer Park, what do you see when you look at our forces now?" Suji thought carefully. The coalition ships moved differently now. They fought differently. The soldiers talked differently. "I see. Warriors," she said finally. "The coalition feared this," Lee said quietly. "They feared that bringing back human military leaders would change them, make them more like us." He turned to face her. They were right. New battle footage appeared on their screens. A coalition patrol had engaged a swarm scout force. The coalition ships moved like predators, striking from the shadows, vanishing before the swarm could respond. They fought with a savagery that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "We're teaching them to kill," Lee said. "To hunt. To destroy. Everything the coalition spent centuries trying to forget. We're teaching them to survive." Suja corrected him. Before Lee could respond, Daho burst into the room. His face was pale. "The swarm, they've adapted again. They're hitting multiple targets at once, spreading our forces thin. They're using our own strategy against us." Lee studied the new tactical display. The swarm had indeed learned. They were using hit-and-run attacks, just like he had taught the coalition. But they were doing it with overwhelming numbers. "Get me a channel to all combat units," he ordered. Suji quickly set up the communication link. "Listen carefully," Lee said to his forces. "The enemy has learned our ways. Now we show them why humans were the most feared warriors in Earth's history. Not because we were stronger or faster, but because we never fought the same way twice." He began laying out a new strategy, one that would surprise even the adaptive swarm. As he spoke, Suji watched the faces of the coalition commanders on the screen. They no longer showed doubt or hesitation when Lee gave orders. They had learned to trust the human way of war. "The council won't approve of this new strategy," Daho warned. The council's approval stopped mattering the moment the swarm adapted to our tactics, Lee replied. "Now it's adapt or die. That's the real lesson of human warfare, and it's time the coalition learned it." Suji was working late in the station's archives when she found it. a file so heavily encrypted that it practically screamed importance. She wasn't supposed to be able to open it, but her time with General Lee had taught her new ways of thinking, new ways of solving problems. The file contained records of previous awakening protocols. Lee wasn't the first. He wasn't even the fifth. Her hand shook as she read the reports. General Kim from the trade wars, General Park from the border conflicts. 5 other human generals awakened to fight the coalition's wars. And after each victory, they were, "I see you found it." Daho's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him enter. "You put them back," Sujay said, her voice trembling with anger. "After they won your wars, you froze them again. Like tools you could just put away until next time." Daho sat heavily in a nearby chair. "They were too dangerous to keep active. They started changing us too much, making us too human." Sujay stood up, facing him. "Like we're becoming now. You don't understand. After each victory, they wanted to prepare us for the next war. They wanted to build armies, create weapons. They couldn't stop thinking about future threats." Maybe they were right. Suji gestured at the battle reports on her screen. "Look how unprepared we were for the swarm." The door opened again. General Lee walked in, and from his face, Suji knew he had already figured it out. "How long have you known?" he asked Daho. "Since before we woke you." Daho wouldn't meet his eyes. "The council, they've already voted. After the swarm is defeated, back to ice." Lee's voice was calm, but Sujai could see the tension in his shoulders. "Like all the others. You have to understand," Daho pleaded. "The coalition cannot become a military society. We've seen what that leads to. The destruction, the endless wars, the survival of your people." Lee stepped closer to Daho. "The ability to defend yourselves." Suji moved between them. "The council can't do this. Not again. The coalition needs to change. The galaxy isn't the peaceful place they want it to be." "That's exactly what General Park said," Daho replied, "before she started building weapon platforms around every coalition world. What General Kim said before he tried to create a standing army." And they were right. Lee's fist hit the desk, making both Sujui and Daho jump. "You want to know why humans survived so long? Because we never forgot our enemies. We never let ourselves become soft." Alarms began blaring throughout the station. The swarm had launched another attack, bigger than any before. On the screens, Sujay could see they had adapted again, using new tactics that even Lee hadn't predicted. "We need to respond," Sujay said. "Why?" Lee asked, his voice bitter. "So I can win another battle, save another world, then go back to being a frozen reminder of everything the coalition fears." "Because people are dying," Suji answered. "And you're not just a weapon to be used and put away. You're a teacher. You've shown us what we need to become." She pulled up the latest battle footage. "Look at our forces. Look how they fight now. That won't go away when they freeze you. The coalition is changing, and they can't stop it." Lee studied the screens, watching coalition ships execute complex battle maneuvers that would have been impossible months ago. They fought with human aggression but alien precision. Something new, something powerful. "The council is afraid of creating warriors," Suji continued. "But you've created something more. You've created survivors." Daho watched them both, conflict clear on his face. "If you win this war, if you save us all, I don't know if I can watch them put you back in that pod." "Then help us change their minds," Suji said. "Help us show them that being strong doesn't mean losing who we are. It means being ready to protect what we care about." Lee looked at the battle reports one more time, then straightened his uniform. "First, we win this fight. Then we deal with the council. And this time," he smiled grimly, "we're going to finish the lesson they've been trying so hard not to learn." The command center was chaos. Red warning lights flashed everywhere as reports came in from all sectors. The swarm had launched their biggest attack yet. They're hitting everything. Daho shouted over the noise. Colonies, stations, supply lines. All at once. General Lee stood calmly in the center of the storm, watching the tactical displays. The swarm had indeed learned from him, perhaps too well. They were using every human tactic he had taught the coalition, but with overwhelming numbers. "Sir, we're losing the outer defense stations," Sujai reported. "Our forces are spread too thin. We can't hold them everywhere." "We're not supposed to," Lee said quietly. Everyone in the command center turned to look at him. "This is exactly what I wanted them to do." Sujai stared at him. "You wanted this?" Lee nodded, a grim smile on his face. "The swarm thinks they've learned warfare from us, but they've only learned the basics. Now it's time to teach them about human desperation." He pressed a button on the main console. "All forces fall back to secondary positions. Abandon the outer stations." The council members who were present erupted in protest. "You can't give up our defense line." One shouted. "Those stations cost billions to build." "Stations can be rebuilt," Lee said firmly. "But I need the swarm to think they've won, to think they've beaten us at our own game." Suji watched as coalition ships retreated from their positions. The swarm pressed forward, taking station after station. But something about their advance bothered her. It seemed too easy. "Look at their formation." Lee pointed to the display. "They're advancing in perfect attack patterns. The patterns we used. The patterns I taught our forces." He turned to Suji. "What's the first rule of human warfare?" "Never fight the same way twice," she answered, understanding beginning to dawn. "Exactly." Lee activated a new set of commands. "And now we show them why." Hidden among the abandoned stations, silent and dark, were special ships. Ships loaded with new weapons that Sujai had helped develop. Weapons based on old Earth mining technology. As the swarm moved past them, these ships came to life. "Now," Lee ordered. The hidden ships fired devices that looked like simple missiles, but when they hit the swarm ships, they didn't explode. Instead, they attached themselves and began drilling, just like the mining machines that had once dug into Earth's asteroids. The swarm ships tried to adapt, tried to defend themselves, but they couldn't stop what they couldn't understand. Their biological armor, so effective against energy weapons, was useless against simple mechanical drills. They never considered physical weapons, Lee explained as they watched. Why would they? Energy weapons are more advanced, more civilized. But humans never forgot the simple solutions. The swarm formations began to break apart. Their perfect patterns dissolved into chaos as ships tried to escape the drilling weapons. But Lee wasn't done. "Phase 2, he commanded. Coalition forces emerged from hiding, but they weren't fighting like before. Each ship had new tactics, new strategies. Some released clouds of tiny robots that invaded swarm ships through the holes drilled by the first attack. Others used old-style projectile weapons that the swarm's energy shields couldn't stop. "You didn't just teach our forces one way of fighting," Suji realized. "You taught them to innovate, to think like humans." "The greatest strength of humanity was never our weapons," Lee said. "It was our ability to adapt, to change, to surprise our enemies when they thought they had us figured out." The battle turned into a rout. The swarm, for the first time, was truly confused. Their attempts to copy human tactics fell apart when faced with completely new strategies they hadn't seen before. Daho watched in amazement as the mighty swarm fleet retreated. "This could be the turning point of the war," he said. "No," Lee replied. "The turning point was when the coalition finally accepted that peace isn't just about being peaceful. It's about being strong enough to defend that peace." He looked at Suji. "And being smart enough to learn from the past instead of hiding from it." As they watched the coalition forces chase the retreating swarm, Suji knew that the real victory wasn't just in space. It was here, in the way the coalition had finally learned to embrace change. To become something new, not just human, not just peaceful, but something stronger than both. The training room was different now. What had once been a simple space was now filled with combat simulators, tactical displays, and practice weapons. But the biggest change was in the soldiers who trained there. General Lee walked among them, watching as teams of mixed species worked together. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were thinking, adapting, creating new strategies on their own. "Show me what you've planned," he said to one team leader, a young alien from a species that had once sworn never to fight. The soldier brought up a holographic display of their latest tactical innovation. It combined the speed of their lighter ships with the natural camouflage abilities of their species, something entirely new, neither human nor alien, but a perfect blend of both. "Very good," Lee said, nodding with approval. "You're not just copying human tactics anymore. You're making them your own." Sujoy entered the training room, carrying new battle reports. The swarm had retreated from 3 more sectors, but they weren't giving up. They were regrouping, trying to find new ways to fight. "They still don't understand," she said to Lee. "They think if they just study our tactics enough, they'll find a way to beat us." "That's because they don't understand what makes humans different," Lee replied. "We never had the strongest ships, the best weapons, or the most advanced technology. We survived because we never stopped learning, never stopped changing." Daeho joined them, looking more comfortable in the military environment than he had months ago. "The council has been watching these training sessions," he said. "They're impressed. Impressed enough to let me stay awake this time." Lee asked with a slight smile. Before Daeho could answer, alarms sounded throughout the station. But these weren't the desperate warnings of before. These were different. The sound of a military force ready for action. The swarm had launched another attack. But this time, the coalition was ready. On the main screen, they watched as coalition ships moved with perfect coordination. Each species used their unique abilities in ways the swarm could never predict. "Look at them," Suji said proudly. "They're not just soldiers anymore. They're warriors, but they haven't lost who they are." She was right. The coalition forces fought with skill and courage, but also with mercy. They disabled swarm ships when they could, destroyed them only when necessary. They protected each other, worked together, showed that being strong didn't mean being cruel. "This is what the council feared," Lee said quietly. "Not that we would teach them to fight, but that we would change who they are." But they didn't understand that change isn't always bad. In the training room, a new group of recruits arrived. They were from worlds that had been attacked by the swarm, worlds that had once been purely peaceful. But now they came wanting to learn, not just to fight, but to protect. "Tell me," Lee said to them, "why are you here?" A young recruit stepped forward. "Because the galaxy isn't always peaceful," she said, "and someone needs to protect the peace." Lee smiled. It was the answer he had hoped for. Not a love of war, but an understanding of its necessity. Not a desire for violence, but a willingness to defend others. "Then let me teach you what humanity learned over thousands of years," he said. "Not just how to fight, but when to fight. Not just how to win, but what victory really means." As he began their first lesson, Suji watched the faces of the recruits. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't angry. They were determined. They had found a balance between the coalition's peaceful nature and humanity's warrior spirit. "This is your real victory," she said to Lee later. "Not defeating the swarm, but teaching us how to be strong without losing ourselves." Lee looked out at the stars, at the galaxy that was changing, growing, becoming something new. "No," he said, "this is humanity's legacy. Not war, but the wisdom to know when it's necessary. Not violence, but the strength to protect what matters." The station hummed with activity as more recruits arrived. More species joined the training, and the coalition evolved. They were becoming something unprecedented, a civilization that could be both peaceful and strong, both gentle and fierce. They were becoming survivors. The council chamber was silent as the final battle recordings played on the large screen. They showed the swarm's last desperate attack and their final defeat. After a year of war, it was over. General Lee stood before the council, his uniform crisp and clean. Suji and Daeho stood behind him, waiting for the council's decision. The swarm has retreated beyond the galaxy's edge, the head counselor said. Their remaining ships are scattered and broken. Thanks to your leadership, the coalition has survived. Lee nodded but said nothing. He knew what was coming next. Now we must decide, the counselor continued, whether to follow our traditional protocol, whether you should return to cryo sleep like the generals before you. Sujai stepped forward. Council members, I have evidence you need to see. She activated a data display. These are reports from every world in the coalition, not just about the war, but about what we've learned. The display showed training centers, defense stations, and schools, places where coalition species work together, learning not just to fight, but to protect, to defend, to survive. What the general taught us isn't just about warfare, Suji said. It's about being strong enough to maintain peace, about understanding that sometimes you have to fight to protect what you love. Daeho spoke next. I was afraid of what he would turn us into. But look at what we've become. He showed images of coalition ships helping rebuild destroyed worlds, protecting refugee ships, standing guard over peaceful planets. We're not warmongers, he said. We're guardians now. We know how to fight, but we choose when not to. The council members whispered among themselves. Lee watched them carefully, seeing the conflict in their faces. Then he stepped forward to speak. Before you make your decision, he said, let me tell you about Earth, about how we destroyed ourselves. The chamber went quiet again. We didn't die because we knew how to fight, Lee continued. We died because we never learned when to stop. We fought over resources instead of sharing them. We fought over differences instead of celebrating them. We fought because we didn't know how to do anything else. He gestured to the coalition forces on the screen. But look at what you've created here. You've taken humanity's greatest strength, our ability to adapt and survive, and combined it with your greatest strength, your dedication to peace. You've become something better than either of us were alone. Suji held up a new report. The latest surveys show that crime in coalition space has dropped. Piracy is almost gone. Even border disputes are being resolved peacefully, because everyone knows we can fight if we have to, but we choose not to. The head counselor stood. General Lee, your work has changed us. Some would say too much, but perhaps change was necessary. She looked at the other council members. We need to vote on your fate. But before they could vote, Lee raised his hand. Actually, he said, I have a proposal. Everyone in the chamber looked at him with surprise. Don't put me back in cryo sleep, he said. Let me die naturally, when my time comes. But in the meantime, let me teach. Not just about fighting, but about the price of war, about why peace is always better, about how to be strong enough to defend that peace. He smiled at Suji and Daeho. Your people have taught me as much as I taught them. You've shown me that there's a better way than what we had on Earth. Let me help you keep that balance. The council chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then the head counselor smiled. All those in favor. The vote was unanimous. Later, as they left the chamber, Suji asked Lee, Are you sure about this? About staying awake, growing old, dying? Lee looked out at the stars, at the peaceful worlds shining in the darkness. On Earth, we never found the balance between peace and strength. We only knew extremes, total war or false peace. But here, he gestured at a group of recruits walking past, different species working together. Here you found something better, and I want to be part of it. Besides, he added with a smile, the next time war comes, you won't need to wake up an old human general. You'll know how to handle it yourselves. Suji watched as he walked toward the training center, where new guardians of peace waited to learn from humanity's last general. The coalition had changed, but so had he. They had all become something new, something that combined the best of humanity's strength with the wisdom to use it wisely.